If you were with us 2 weeks ago, you know we entered into that portion of Genesis where we were studying the life of Noah. And we've centered our attention on chapter 6, 7, into chapter 8. And we're going to pick up on his story tonight. In fact, I've entitled our lesson this evening, "A New Beginning is Not Enough." If that sounds like a curious title, it will make more sense as we go further in to Noah's story. But as you would think about new beginnings, I think all of us at different points in our life look forward to fresh starts where perhaps the circumstances we've known have been challenging or have tested us or have been disappointed. And so in a longing way, we look toward a new slate, a new opportunity, something that might give us a new beginning. And I would stress, I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing to want, but you need to be aware new beginnings don't always guarantee the outcomes that you would hope for, that the new situations or the new setting doesn't guarantee a superior context. Well, we're going to see that to some degree as we move into this portion of Noah's story. As we emphasize chapter 6, 7, and 8, let me remind you of what we covered 2 weeks ago. In fact, if you were with us, I said, when you come to the story of Noah, you make a mistake in approaching this biblical account as if Noah is the key figure in all of this. The fact is, God is the key figure in all of this. And if you survey the early chapters of Noah's experience, 6, 7, and 8, you'll observe that. Now, the way I summarize that for us, if you remember, is in chapter 6, it emphasizes that God sees what's going on in the midst of humanity's rebellion. Also in chapter 6, it explains to us that God grieves over what he sees. And I would just remind us even tonight, that still is the case. God sees what is happening in our world. He sees what is taking place in our lives. And when humanity rebels against God, let's be clear, God still grieves over that. But we learned, based upon Noah's experience, that God goes from grief to judgment, that God announces to Noah that he will judge humanity given their state of rebellion. Though he announces the judgment, he then offers to Noah some reassurance that God is going to provide for Noah and for his sons and their families, that he's going to ultimately save them from the judgment that would be directed toward sinful humanity. So in the early chapters of Noah's life, God sees, God grieves, God judges, God provides, God saves. Tonight, we're going to return to chapter 8, and we're going to move through chapters 8 and 9 and notice the emphases, the progression of events as is recorded by Moses concerning Noah. Starting with, if you have your handout, God remembers. We touched on this somewhat 2 weeks ago, that as God is providing for Noah and ultimately saving Noah, that at a crucial point, it emphasizes that God remembers Noah. Now, tonight, as we move through the handout, I'll let you know in advance, there wasn't room in this evening's handout to have all of the verses that I'll be reading. So if you have a phone app or if a Bible in front of you, you'll be able to refer to the verses that I could not include. But I did include Genesis 8:1 for our benefit. And listen to what is said concerning God toward Noah. It reads, "But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark." that statement is made in the context of God judging humanity. The rains have been falling, the waters have risen. Humanity is experiencing a devastating judgment. And in the midst of that, it says, God remembers Noah. This emphasis on God's remembrance is not to be understood to suggest that God forgot about Noah in the process of everything that was going on. No, that term, he remembers, is underscoring God's faithfulness or fidelity to Noah. That despite what was happening outside of the ark, God absolutely had his attention on Noah. That he remembers Noah in the midst of this episode of judgment. And specifically, God remembers his covenant to save. Now, here I would point you to the reference that's in the handout that takes us back to chapter 6, as God is announcing to Noah that he is in the process or will inevitably judge humanity for their sin. He says this to Noah in verses 17 and 18 of that 6th chapter. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But, verse 18, I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. What I stress with you is that God's remembrance here is not reactive. It's highlighting the covenant faithfulness that God has toward Noah. He expressed to Noah in that 6th chapter, I am establishing a covenant with you now to save you. By the way, this is the first time in the book of Genesis that the word covenant is used. Just notable to me, the first example of a covenant was a covenant to rescue, to save, to deliver. So in Genesis 6, God expresses to Noah, I will enter into a covenant with you to save you from the judgment that will come. So that when we come to Genesis 8 and verse 1, and it says God remembers Noah, that's what he's remembering. He's remembering the covenant that he made to save Noah. Now, I throw into the handout a further thought that I hope will be an encouragement to us. Here's the good news. God never forgets his promises. When he enters into covenant, when he makes a promise to a person, he never forgets them. He maintains them. He is committed toward them. So in our case, when we think about the covenant of salvation directed toward us through Jesus, let me remind you of Jesus' familiar words. Jesus said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. I want us to know God will never forget that covenant towards you. So that when we face what the world will face when it comes to a future judgment for sin, you can be assured that God will remember you as you've turned to the Lord Jesus Christ. That there's nothing that you should be fearful about in terms of facing that upcoming judgment. That God will have you on his mind even as he had Noah on his mind in the midst of the rain and the flood. Which brings us to our second emphasis. We're told God remembers. He remembers the covenant. But we're also informed that God prepares. And this is described for us as you move on into that 8th chapter. In fact, let me take you to the middle part of verse 1. Some of this is in the handout. Let me read the extended passage all the way to verse 14. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Now, let me interrupt the reading here. Pay attention to how specific the details are concerning this event. This is not a biblical legend or a myth, as I tried to highlight in the series title. This is more than a story. It's certainly more than a children's story. What's been reported to us is an event that happened, and the details are given to help us appreciate, indeed, this is what transpired. That God is here in the process of preparing the earth for Adam and his sons and their families to leave the ark. Now, I stopped the reading in the handout at verse 4. Let me read on from verse 5 and to verse 14. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. If there's any question whether or not this was a flood that was global in nature, I think we can all agree that any flood level that exceeds the peaks of a mountain is going to be global in nature. And that does appear to be the description here. Verse 6, at the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her feet, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand, took her, and brought her into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him anymore. In the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. Verse 14, in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Now, I described this section as God prepares, and that's exactly what's being recorded here. Appreciate, if you would, as I note in the handout, the same God who unleashed the waters now restrains them. God is acting intentionally to prepare the earth. The fountains close, the rain stops, the waters recede, the ark rests there in the mountains of Ararat, the earth dries. Everything that brought judgment is now reversed. Deliberately, precisely, completely. And I would say what is depicted here are not random actions on God's part. It is an ordered restoration. I detect an echo from Genesis 1, at least as I read this particular part of the 8th chapter. In Genesis 8:1, it says God made a wind blow over the earth. Now, what's lost in our English Bibles is the Hebrew word for wind is the Hebrew term ruach, which incidentally is the Hebrew word for breath and also the Hebrew word for spirit. And so you translate the term based upon the context. Now, why is that relevant? Well, in Genesis 1, we're told that Ruach was above the waters. The Spirit of God was there preparing for this work of creation that is then described in Genesis chapter 1. Well, the same term now is used here in Genesis 8. It's translated wind, but what I want you to associate with is this, that God is actively engaged to bring about what's needed to prepare a place for Noah and his family to dwell. That the Spirit of God, the breath of God, the wind of God is working to bring about what is required. In Genesis 1, God brought order out of chaos. In Genesis 8, I would argue he's doing it again. He is preparing a habitat for Noah and the sons and their wives. He is involved in a process of recreation. Now, one other comment I make with regard to the handout, God doesn't just rescue, he prepares what comes next. And often that preparation is slow. As I read through the passage in the 8th chapter, it kept mentioning time frames. What I want you to note with me is that the pace of God's preparation was probably slower than what Noah would have preferred. 150 days of prevailing water, months before the land begins to reappear. And then even then, there's this additional waiting before he will receive the instruction to leave the ark. Waiting is never something that we would prefer to do when it comes to what God may be doing. I admire Noah in his faith to trust God over the great length of time required on the ark. If you do the math, and you can figure it out based upon some of the information that is provided in Genesis, it appears they were on the ark 370 days. That's a long time. And just to remind you, in the midst of that extended period of time, do imagine the level of uncertainty that had to be present while Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives were on the ark. And what's going on? God didn't tell them the length of time. He commanded them to enter the ark. They did so by faith. And 370 days later, they are directed to exit the ark. Great patience on their part. Which brings me to our next section. God prepares a place, the earth again, for them to live upon, and then life emerges. Genesis 8, verses 15 and following describe that. Then God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." Quick emphasis, life emerges at God's command. Now in Genesis 1, we know life came into being at God's command. In Genesis 8, God has sustained and preserved life on the ark, but do appreciate they emerge from the ark at God's command. They didn't leave this vessel whenever Noah thought it was time. Again, the way that's expressed in the Hebrew in verse 15, go out from the ark in the Hebrew text is an imperative. God commands him, now's the time for you to leave. So life emerges at God's command. Second, the earth, once covered in judgment, now begins again. The earth begins to be filled with life. Personally, I can't imagine what it must have been like for Noah and his sons to manage the exit of all of these species, all of these creatures that have dwelt with them on the ark for well over a year. I'm assuming that God was very much involved in that process. And here I am entirely speculating. I personally believe God was very much involved in maintaining the order and the livability of the conditions on the boat. How he did that, what was involved in that, we're not informed of with great detail, but I'm pretty sure God enabled Noah and his families to handle the conditions successfully. And then, as God commands them to leave the ark, I have no doubt that God was engaged in facilitating that. And then even further, as all of these species departed from their floating zoo of sorts, God would then begin to, I think, drive these creatures out and immediately enable them to be fruitful and multiply. That just as God was, as creator, engaged in the introduction of life in Genesis 1, let's equally assume that God would be directly involved and engaged in the propagation of life now as all of these various species depart from the ark. So we see that and hopefully can appreciate God's role in all of that. But here's a critical truth before we move on to Noah's response and worship. Here we have described for us a new beginning. But a new beginning for Noah and his family is not the same thing as a new heart, is it? Now, I'm going to highlight what is a very appropriate and impressive response on the part of Noah following his departure from the ark. But what I'm wanting us to also come to terms with is, as Noah and his family depart the ark, they have a new world that has been washed and made ready for them, but when it comes to their hearts and their inner workings, it's the same family that entered into the ark prior to God's judgment. Well, let me move us on to focus on Noah's response of worship. We see, as life emerges, that Noah immediately worships the Lord. That's recorded for us in verse 20 of the 8th chapter. Then Noah, we're told, built an ark to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. This is significant. Noah's first highlighted action following the dispersal of the animals, his first highlighted action is to worship. It doesn't describe Noah immediately going to build a shelter or quickly seeking to plant for a future harvest, nor does it discuss Noah gathering with the sons to have an organizational meeting. Rather, what we're told is apparently his first action of note was to worship, was to direct his heart toward the Lord. It says he built an altar, and then he took some of the clean animals that had been with them on the ark for that extended period, and he offered them to God as sacrifices. As I would suggest in the handout, what we observe from that is Noah's offering, at least on some level, reflects faith and sacrifice on his part. Now, how does it display faith? I think it informs us that Noah understood why he survived the flood. He did not survive this judgment of God because he somehow was able to manage things, or he constructed this ark and he saved himself. No, Noah understood full well that he was now standing on dry ground as a result of God's grace and mercy, that he was saved by God. So, in light of that, it would be a fitting response for Noah to quickly build an altar and to express to God his thanksgiving and gratitude by placing these sacrifices before him. It would be an acknowledgement of faith, an appropriate acknowledgement of faith. And I would remind all of us, having experienced salvation as each of us have through Jesus, his Son, the most natural response of a saved heart, you would think, would be to worship the Lord, to direct your heart heavenward. But I say that Noah's offering reflects faith. It also reflects sacrifice. Now, why do I describe that? And by that, I mean more than he's placed a sacrifice on the offering. No, to present some of the clean animals to God as offerings before God was going to be sacrificial. There was a limited supply. I think it was 7 pairs for the different clean animals that had been with Noah on the ark for that extended time. And what, as you read the text, seems to be described is Noah seemed generous with what he was placing before the Lord with regard to these sacrifices. It would have been easy for Noah to rationalize, listen, we have limited resources. Not sure how all of this is going to work moving into the future. Maybe I need to hold more back. You don't get any of that impression. Rather, what you read instead is here Noah leaves the ark and immediately presents to God that which would cost him. It was a true sacrifice. And before I move on, let me say, I think, again, those of us who experience salvation, life, and hope in Jesus, when we talk about worshiping the Lord and giving to the Lord, I hope that oftentimes what God detects within us is a sacrificial disposition that cost us something. We don't just give God the leftover or the overflow. No, we present to God something that indeed may prove costly to us because we believe he deserves it. And as you look at what is described with regard to Noah's worship, it is also, I think, instructive to appreciate God's reaction. God is pleased by what Noah chooses to do. That's recorded in verse 21. I have that verse in your handout. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, now let me stop there. The phrase smell, that's an anthropomorphic characterization of God. We're describing him in human terms. God, in that spirit being, doesn't have a nose to be smelling this offering. And yet it conveys, in a human sense, the impact there, that it was pleasing to God, that God was blessed as he observes Noah presenting to him, immediately having departed the ark, an offering that conveyed faith and thanksgiving to him, that blessed God. And it blessed him so much, he begins to speak to himself, and pay attention to what he says to himself, because it's significant. Because of what he observes from Noah, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again strike down every living creature as I have done. Now, there are a couple of things there that stand out to me. God is speaking to himself, And he says, in response to Noah's offering, I will never again judge humanity and the earth in this way. That's quite a statement. Now, see the correlation. He makes that statement to himself in response to Noah's worship. That impacted God's response. And here's the second thing that is significant. God acknowledges that human sinfulness persists. Did you see that? Look at what God says. I will not curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. God's diagnosis of humanity is that humanity still is characterized by sinfulness from their youth, that there's that internal bent away from God. And yet, nevertheless, what does God say? In response to Noah's act of worship, I will never again judge the earth for their sin in this way, despite their sinfulness. So God is pleased, and what results from his pleasure? Future mercy. God extends mercy far beyond Noah in the midst of this situation. That's significant. Now, there is the corollary thought to that, as I included it in the handout. The flood restrained sin, but did not remove it. God judged a dark, rebellious humanity to restrain what was growing out of control. He preserved Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, but God knows that the 8 individuals inside the ark are still sinful individuals. And the 8 individuals that would leave the ark as sinful individuals. And yet God promises to himself, I'm not going to react to humanity's sin in this same way. But let me move us quickly along. We go from Noah's worship to God's recommission. And I think those should be connected. God responds to this act of worship, of faith on Noah's part, and he recommissions Noah and his sons. Chapter 9, verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Does that sound familiar? It's the echo, if you think about it, of what is recorded at the end of Genesis chapter 1. And in a way, the descendants of Adam, Noah and his sons, are sent now back into the world with a renewed purpose. Let me refresh your memory. Genesis 1, verse 28. And God blessed them. See the parallel. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Do you see the connection? That as they're leaving the ark, God now is recommissioning the descendants of Adam to assume the role that God originally had for Adam and Eve. So they are given this renewed purpose. However, it should be noted, the world after the flood is not the same world. It's different. I think it's going to be different in a number of different ways. I think even in terms of the topography of the earth, that changed as a result of the earth opening up, the waters rising from beneath and from above. I think just the physical appearance of the earth changed. I think in terms of the ecology of life on the planet following the flood, that changed. So there's a lot that changed after God's judgment of the earth by flood. But that's not where the difference is emphasized in chapter 9. I didn't have room for verses 2 through 7. Let me read them for you and listen to the different world that Noah and his family are directed to oversee. Verse 2 reads, "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered." That's new. There's now going to be a fearful interaction between humanity and the other parts of creation, the other species that had been with them on the ark for that extended period. Verse 3, "Every moving thing that lives," he says, "now shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything." That too appears to be a change. Now, there's some commentators that discuss perhaps they were already eating meat prior to the flood, and now it's formalized as God is addressing this. I don't know that we can prove it this way or that, but clearly now it is being stated that humanity would begin to eat the animals in a way that they had been eating the plants. Verse 5, with regard to the eating of animals, verse 4, "You shall not eat flesh with its life," that is, its blood. So he's going to allow blood to be the symbol of life, and he's saying how you would eat these various animals. You would approach that so that the blood is not a part of what you're eating. Verse 5, "And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning from every beast. I will require it from man, from his fellow man. I will require a reckoning for the life of man." So that if an animal attacks a man or a woman, kills them, that animal is to be put to death, is the implication. And at the same time, he then adds, if another man or a woman murders another man or woman, that individual too would be put to death. Now, how is this different? Well, we know after Cain slew his brother Abel, God preserved the life of Cain. He marked him. But at that point, it appears God was going to allow Cain to be an object lesson, a warning, by maintaining his life to discourage people from moving toward violence and murder. It obviously did not work. And so now, as they are moving into this new phase, God is saying you're going to elevate the sacredness of life by requiring the punishment of a person who has taken the life of another to forfeit their life. And he explains the rationale. Verse 6, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." So that you'll employ this approach because it will be a further acknowledgement that every individual has a sacred sense of life and worth because they are in my image. And if that individual's life has been taken from them wrongfully, the wrongdoer will be held accountable, and their life, based upon what's being described here, will be forfeited. Then he adds, verse 7, "And you will be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it." So Noah, his sons, their families have this new commission, but it's going to be lived out in a very different world. There's fear in the animal world. There's violence that must be restrained, and accountability is emphasized. Now, if you read between the lines here, what does this passage also suggest to us? God is anticipating the violence. God recognizes that though he has these four families that he's just rescued and saved, that from them and through the generations that will follow them, the problem of sin will persist. Two comments I have in the handout just to close this section out. Even though things have changed, the image of God remains within man. God is the one that states that. That's why we would review, why we would elevate the value of life, because we recognize the image of God in each person. But here's the other thing that I was just alluding to. A renewed environment and purpose do not cure sin. You couldn't have a greater fresh start than what Noah and his sons are about to have. And yet, based upon what we've read, God's expectation is this fresh start is not going to alter the trajectory that has been set by the descendants of Adam following the garden, which is really a sobering thing to take into account. Well, let me move us on to the final sections just to have us see how this account wraps up. As God recommissions Noah, a covenant is announced. That's the way I phrase it. It's just announced. Verse 9, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you. As many as came out of the ark, it is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. What I want you to notice is this. Following Noah's act of worship, God speaks to himself. And what does God say to himself? Though humanity remains sinful, I will extend my mercy. He's saying that to himself. Well, here in chapter 9, verse 9, he's saying it out loud to Noah. He's announcing an unconditional covenant. And when I say unconditional, there's nothing within what he just described that is dependent upon humanity's actions one way or the other. God just announces unilaterally, this is what I will commit to, that I will not again respond to humanity's rebellion and sinfulness in the way that I responded through the flood. That is not to suggest that it will not be a future day of judgment for sin. Jesus tells us that day's coming. But it will not be as a result of rising waters that will cover the earth. No, God says that will not happen again. The covenant was unilateral. It's God who initiates it. It's universal. It includes all of creation, and it is everlasting. God says, I will not violate this commitment, and he will prove faithful to his word. To further reassure Noah, God supplies a visible sign and reminder. That's recorded in verses 12 and following. Didn't have room in the handout for it. Let me read it quickly for our benefit. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I've set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. Now, he's not saying there will never be floods. He's talking about a global flood that will encompass the earth. Verse 16, when the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. Now, I would say to us, I think this symbol, covenant sign, was necessary because rains would return. And what does God say? You don't have to fear the rain clouds, Noah. You can let your future generations understand that I will never again judge the earth with the flood in a way that you have experienced. I will not do it. And you will see in the heavens a sign to that effect. He constantly refers to it as a bow. We've referred to it as the rainbow. But I think the language of the bow is interesting because that bow would have been the instrument of a weapon. And God is saying, I'm going to put a symbol of the weapon in the heavens, not to cause you to dread, but to reassure you that that will never happen again in that way. And I think it's worth appreciating that God incorporated it into the natural system of things, so that when the clouds form and the rains come, that periodically, from our point of view, randomly, you'll see a rainbow appear. Final thought there, God says it will be there to reassure you, but it is also there to remind me. That, again, to me is fascinating. God never forgets anything, so what's the point in the reminder? No, it's God's way of saying it will remind me of my covenant to you, that I will prove faithful not to move to act in that way again. Final thought before we look at the last section, the covenant preserves the world, but it does not redeem it. God is saying, I will never judge the world in this manner again, but it's not a covenant that redeems a sinful world. Which brings us to the final section that I have entitled Sin and Shame Remains. A surprising account. If we've been following Noah's story to this point, listen to what's recorded starting in verse 9. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these three the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil. I guess he was following in Adam's example. And he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both of their shoulders, walked backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. They were trying to hide his shame. They were not doing anything to dishonor him, in contrast to Ham. Verse 24, when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Admittedly, this is an unusual account. Once again, commentators go back and forth in describing what transpired exactly. I don't want to project onto the passage what we don't definitively know. What I would rather do is highlight what is clear. That what is recorded here is yet another example of sin and shame, in whatever form that it takes. That here we have Noah, a man in Genesis 6 that is described as righteous, who walks with God, who suddenly overdrinks and finds himself in an unseemly position, and then his youngest son, Ham, reacts in a way that dishonors him. Personally, I don't think there's anything sexual implied in that other than an act to shame and dishonor his father. And what the account, I think, highlights still further is that though God has preserved these four families from the judgment for sin, the problem with sin remains. You don't even get out of chapter 9, and you have an embarrassing situation. And then the curse that's pronounced against Canaan, and we'll touch base on this more next week as we move into chapters 10 and 11. The curse is really projecting what will be the horrible testimony surrounding the descendants of Canaan and their behavior and their sinful approach to life. But it's painful to see as we come to the end of this chapter that though God has rescued the family, the issue of sin and the problems associated with it's still there. See, God certainly washed the earth with the flood, but he did not, in this instance, wash the heart. So what does all of this mean for us? And I don't have but a moment to touch base on it, but I want you to think about it all the same. When I look at these two chapters, certain lessons stand out. First, God works mercifully to restore what sin and judgment destroys. God is acting with mercy and grace, despite the judgment that was directed against such a rebellious segment of humanity. Second, as I've tried to allude throughout the lesson, a new beginning does not fix the human heart. Sometimes we think if I just could have a fresh opportunity. That doesn't affect the heart. It did not affect the situation with Noah and his sons. What we need, if we are honest about it, is a new heart. That's what we need. And as you move through the Old Testament, it will continue, I think, to be highlighted that though God will provide guidance, God will provide laws, God will provide instruction, what will begin to be revealed consistently is what ultimately needs to happen is a new heart within man. And here's the good news. God put into motion a plan to do that. A couple of references in your handout, Jeremiah 31:33. The prophet, as God would speak through him, points to a day when there will be given a new heart, that the people, that he will write his law on their hearts. And then in Ezekiel 36, verses 26 and 27, that's the language there. I'll read those two verses. And I will give you a new heart, a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh, and I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and to be careful of my rules. What is God projecting? He's projecting a day where he's doing more than simply changing the setting. He's changing the hearts of the people within the setting. Now, how would he facilitate that? Well, as I note in the handout, and as I mentioned on Sunday, if what we need is a new heart, we need Jesus, don't we? That's why Jesus came. That's what Jesus did. Jesus was able to bring forward for our benefit the spiritual ability to experience a change of heart inwardly through the Holy Spirit. I love how the Apostle Paul captures some of this in 2 Corinthians. It's in your handout. Verse 17 reads, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ," Paul writes, "he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come." And then in verse 21, he quickly adds, "For our sake, he, God, made him, Jesus, to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him, Jesus, we might become the righteousness of God." What Paul is celebrating is what Jesus can facilitate. That where there's proven to be the inadequacy in the old covenant to change the direction of humanity's life, through Jesus, there's the possibility that we experience an inward change. Now, let me quickly concede, when one turns to Jesus, it's not a complete heart transplant. What begins to occur through the Holy Spirit is a daily transformation of who we are, where he begins to affect our thinking and then in terms of that, our behavior. But here's the wonderful news. The day is going to come, as we full well know, that Jesus is going to appear. And when he appears, as he gathers unto himself those that have turned to him by faith, what results in that moment is the completion of that transplant. that transformation. That we will then, in that moment of time, become as He is. Where any remnant of sin and the fallen nature that has plagued humanity for millennia, that will be eliminated. Praise be to God. And we will enter into eternity with God with a completely renewed heart, so that we can dwell in God's presence without the struggles that have characterized humanity for really humanity's history since the Garden of Eden. Next week, looking ahead, if you would, go ahead and look at chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 is just a genealogical chapter. You're not going to have a lot of fun with that, but it sets the stage for the description of Babel and what happens notably in that particular chapter. So read ahead, and then we'll pick up the account in Genesis so that we can continue to learn those lessons that God would help us to see. Let me dismiss us in prayer. Father, I'm grateful again that we can come to your word and gain perspective about the human experience. What we read in Genesis are not myths and stories that are just there to spin a tale. What we read are events that inform us about you and likewise inform us about us and our need for Jesus. So Lord, I pray as we've considered tonight's lesson, you continue to help us to gain the understanding and the insight that would benefit us in our life of faith. Help us to respond to you in ways that we ought, to honor you in ways that we should, to trust in you so that your influence in who we are, that more of you will be seen in us tomorrow than what we permitted to be seen today. We would ask for that spiritual work of grace. Watch over us as we go our different ways. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for being with us. Look forward to seeing you on Sunday.